Hi, I'm Misha Ketchell, editor of The Conversation. For democracy to work, people need to be well informed. That's why we work with academic experts to share their research and explain issues in the news. Everything we do is free to republish, but we need your support. Please donate to The Conversation by going to donate.theconversation.com or following the link in the show notes.
From The Conversation, this is Politics with Michelle Grattan.
This year's budget has become the most controversial since that of the Abbott government in 2014. Its changes to negative gearing, capital gains tax, and the treatment of trusts have produced howls of outrage from those potentially affected, as well as criticisms from some experts. But supporters of the changes see them in line with earlier major tax reforms, namely those of the Hawke-Keating government in the 1980s and the Howard Costello government at the turn of the century. One of those making that case is Graeme Samuel, a former head of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. Samuel has been an observer of and a participant in economic changes for decades. He was president of the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, which, in collaboration with the Australian Council of Social Service, ACOS, paved the way for Howard and Costello to introduce the GST. He also led the National Competition Council that implemented competition policy. And in more recent years, he did a review of the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act for the coalition government that has been implemented by the Labor government. Graeme Samuel joins us today to talk about the budget and other issues. Graeme Samuel, you've been watching and involved in economic changes for a very long time. How do the tax reforms in this budget compare with the reforms of prime ministers and treasurers of the past?
These reforms are actually quite mild. If we go back to the extraordinary reforms of the 1980s instituted by Paul Keating with the support of Prime Minister Bob Hawke, they were very extensive reforms. Look, they shook up our financial system in a way that no one could have imagined. John Stone, the Treasury Secretary at the time, broadly opposed a lot of what Paul Keating had proposed, but Keating was determined and he brought them in, and they were seminal in setting us on a market-based economic system in this country. The introduction of the GST was equally a very important reform, a massive reform in terms of income tax and the shifting of the tax burden from wages and salaries through to an all-embracing goods and services tax, a very significant reform. Now, what Treasurer Chalmers has done here is to try and remove the distortions that have been built into the system through successive governments, I have to say primarily coalition governments, which have feather-bedded, if you like, those that have got vested interest, for example, in investing in capital and taking capital gains at an extraordinarily generous 50% discount rate for capital gains, negative gearing, although that's not had as much attention in the post-budget commentary, and trusts. And trusts, look, I've used trusts. We all have. And they do provide a tax advantage. But I have to ask the question, which I know Chalmers has asked over and over again, why is it that we expect our salary and wages earners to contribute more to the funding of government services like hospitals, police forces, defence, schools? Why do we expect them to pay more than those who invest in capital or use trusts and so-called bucket companies? It just isn't fair. It's what we tried to overcome with the GST reforms. We only got part of the way there because of opposition by the then Labor opposition and some machinations brought about by the Democrats, led by Meg Liz at the time. But what Chalmers is trying to do is to bring about reform in terms of a more equitable tax system. Thank heavens we've got him there with that determination.
So, do you believe that the critics, small business, some venture capital firms, have any legitimate points when they oppose these changes, or do you think it's all self-interest?
I think it's very largely driven by self-interest. They've yet to explain the fundamental issue of why it is that salary and wage earners should bear a greater part of the burden for funding of government services like hospitals and schools and police force and the like, than those who invest in capital and get capital gains. So it's largely vested interests. I have to say also, Michelle, I think that what we're seeing here is absolutely typical of any form of reform, and that is vested interests that have had feather bedding and benefits flowing their way for year after year, decade after decade, will always get out there with loud megaphones and attempt to resist the reform. They're ably assisted, unfortunately, by sections of our traditional media, and we know who they are at present. But as you read the traditional media, particularly the financial press and the Australian, you don't actually have to read the articles. You look at the byline, you know immediately what's going to be said, and it is quite extraordinary. I think what capped it off for me the other day with some bemusement was a big headline with a photograph in one of the papers of a business owner who had announced that day that he was going to go into administration of his business, put it into administration because the business had failed as a result of the tax reform proposals by Treasurer Jim Chalmers in this budget. Give us a break. They haven't even been legislated yet, and they won't come into force for almost a year, and you're blaming that on the collapse of your business. Some of this stuff is nonsense, and yet none of the papers picked up on the hypocrisy and the irony of what was being said. So there are agendas out there. It happens all the time. When I was involved in shepherding through the national competition policy reforms, which was to undo the protections given to business in a whole range of areas, the anti-competitive protections, they were mainly instituted by Henry Bolte and Askin up in New South Wales. But when I went through those, and look, the loud megaphones were there, they were marching up and down the street. This is going to be the end of the world, small business will fail, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. It all happened, but see, rarely do you see the average member of the public walking up the street, carrying a placard and saying, this is in the public interest. We ought to be pursuing it. We ought to be continuing it. When we ran the GST campaign, Rob Fitzgerald of ACOS and myself did it as chair of the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. When we did that, there were self-esteemed economists who said that this was going to be the end of the world, that what it will do is to bring in rampant inflation and small businesses will fail like a tsunami had hit them. It didn't happen. We got the GST today, and aside from the mutant GST we got as a result of the intervention of the then Labor opposition and the Democrats, Meg Lees, it's not a bad GST. It'd be better if it was all embracing, but that unfortunately is how politics intervened.
One of the changes that's been fairly quietly accepted, even though there was a lot of argument and controversy about it earlier, is the change to negative gearing. Nevertheless, the Greens and some others would have preferred a model that was different, that capped the number of properties that an investor could negatively gear rather than the model that's been adopted. What do you think?
Look, the problem is that every time a politician or a vested interest suggests some modification, you've got to go through the whole basis of the structure that has been outlined by Treasurer Chalmers in the budget. And it's been a very carefully analysed structure done by Treasury. And I find that every time that there is a suggestion, whether it's by the Greens or a vested interest, whatever it is designed to bring about a result which inevitably is going to lead to a distortion. And it's the distortions in the GST that I think were the fundamental lesson of what happens when you start to bring about reform and then you succumb to the special pleadings and the distortions. So I've got a lot of faith in what's been done. There may be some tweaks. There's been this issue about the so-called death tax, which is dealing with testamentary trusts. And I think there is some recognition that there may be a tweak that's got to be dealt with there to overcome the allegation of a death tax. But that won't stop the vested interests, and in particular the opposition, saying, here we are, you've got a death tax, we got rid of death taxes decades ago, and now suddenly this government's reintroducing them. Well, that's right. Those tweaks can be dealt with. But I do hope, and I've got a lot of faith in the Treasurer and in the Prime Minister, that they've got the determination, the commitment, and above all, the courage to say, this is going to happen. We've got 2 years until the next election, that this vested interest, special pleadings that we're getting at the moment, and as very ably assisted by at least 2 major traditional newspapers, that will fade. And as it fades, then so we will see significant tax reform introduced, and it is tax reform in the interest of equity and fairness. And you can't have greater motivations or imperatives in tax reform than to focus on equity and fairness.
So there should be no carve-outs, you don't think, on capital gains?
The problem is that we had a very good capital gains structure introduced by Keating, and it said if you've got what I call inflation-inspired capital gains, then you shouldn't have to pay tax on that, because that's not something that's occurred otherwise than through the economy and through what's happened with inflation. So we will neuter out the inflation element of a capital gains. But beyond that, why is a capital gain treated any differently to a person that goes and works in a factory or works in a service industry and earns salary? It is simply another means of earning income and should be treated the same way. So I can't see any rationale for carve-outs. There will always be those, the vested interests, that say, but I have been used to this for years, for decades. I've been used to these benefits that Treasurer Costello introduced by introducing the 50% discount. How dare you take it away from me? And I will say that you should never have been offered them in the first place. And it's about time that they were neutered out of the tax system in the interest of fairness and equity in the public interest.
What more tax reform do you think we need? And in particular, what do you think of the proposal that's been put forward by opposition leader Angus Taylor to index the income tax thresholds to inflation?
All right, let me deal with the 2 elements of that question. The first is the further tax reform. The best thing we could do is to further revise or to reform the GST system. The GST was meant to cover everything. And thanks to Meg Lees and the then opposition, we got a mutant. And I've often argued that what would be best to do is, rather than increase the rate of GST, expand it to cover everything. Won't be the end of the world, but if you wanted to neutralise the impact, particularly on what I call must-have products, like everyday groceries and the like, then the way to do that might in fact be to reduce the rate of GST. And I remember saying to Finance Minister John Fay at the time, I said to him, Minister, why don't you reduce the rate to 7% and then have it cover everything?
What did he say?
He said, no, it was too hard, couldn't be done. We were too far into the political debate that had been occurring with Meg Lees to be able to sort of reverse that. But it was thought. So today I would say, go to the states and territories. It's very difficult to do because of the way it's been structured, but go to them and say, look, we will expand the GST to cover everything. There should be no carve-outs from it. But what we'll do is we'll reduce the rate. I don't know whether it's 8% or 7%, whatever it might be, so that we actually neutralise any negative impact on those who might be concerned about the cost of everyday goods, So there's that. Now, the Angus Taylor proposals on indexation sounds good, but I'll tell you what, it's very, very, very expensive. And I'd like to know how it's going to be paid for. Once it's locked in, very hard to get rid of it. It's like the discount that or the reduction, the 50% reduction that we've provided for petrol excise at the moment. Gee, that's going to be fun once that's removed in whatever it is, a month or so's time. And that's the problem. When you build a distortion into the system, and indexation of our tax rates will be a distortion. Once we build that in, it's going to be very, very difficult to get rid of it. and therefore we'll have to build other distortions to compensate for the loss of revenue flowing from that being built in. So I do hope that the opposition, if it wants to carry through with this, can actually demonstrate how they will be able to pay for the clear revenue costs and substantial revenue costs of introducing a long-term, in fact, permanent indexation of tax rates. I just don't think it's going to happen.
A lot of bravery is needed for comprehensive tax reform, and I think that politicians are pretty wary of that these days.
Can you blame them, by the way, Michelle, when you see, for decades now, we have asked, urged, exhorted, pleaded with our politicians to bring about tax reform. So Treasurer Chalmers does it in this budget. And look at the hue and cry and the cries of woe and doomsday that have flowed. The problem with tax reform is that it's very complex. It's very complex indeed. And probably the best economist that's been able to explain it in all this has been Saul Eslake. And he puts it, as I tried to put it before, very, very simply. Why should wage earners pay more, bear a greater share of the burden for the provision of our hospitals, our schools, our police force and our defence than those who have got the benefits of capital gains tax concessions and the use of trusts?
One problem is, however, of course, that if you do limited tax reform, you get a lot of blowback, and you've only done some things, and yet the reaction has been so strong that you don't dare to do the whole job, do you?
Well, yeah, but if you do it step by step, and I see it's interesting, Ken Henry came out with his report, which has been, until now, largely ignored, but Ken has been supportive of what has now been proposed by Treasurer Chalmers. And look, tax reform, because of its complexity, has to be taken step by step. Fortunately, what this government has done is to say, I've got 3 years, we've got a very large majority. The best time to do it is in that first year of this large majority government, and that's what they've done. So it's 12 months after their election. They've got 2 years now to go through not only the explanation, but also the experience of what it does, of what it's about. And maybe all the vested interests will ultimately grow tired, although social media makes it easy. But more importantly, the vast Australian public will see that all the doomsday predictions actually haven't occurred, and that it's actually not as disastrous as what people said. Far from being disastrous, it's certainly more equitable and fairer for the vast majority of Australians.
Vested interests often have a lot of energy, but let's now turn to some other issues. There have been ongoing calls for a new tax on gas exports. There's a lot of public support for that, but the government, of course, has said, no, that's not on the agenda, at least at the moment. What do you think about that?
I'm not persuaded that it's appropriate. Look, what's happened is that because of the distortions brought about by the Iran war, the issues about gas being able to get through the Strait of Hormuz, there's a lot being said about, the gas producers in Australia, it's our gas after all, it's coming from our resources, therefore we should tax them some more. And I think governments analyse this and say, no, hold on, I just don't think that's right. It's very easy to tackle big business, super big business. The primary concern I think we need to do is to focus on two fundamental areas here. The first is to ensure that we have enough gas for our domestic needs. And the second is to reduce the demand for that gas through the expansion of renewables. I was fascinated the other day, Michelle, to read two different headlines in two different newspapers, one of which said, I think it was the Australian Energy Market Operator or the AEMC, one or other, who said that their prediction was that electricity prices would fall. Right? Oh, well, that's good news. And that, Minister Chris Barr must have been pleased with that. Then I read the other newspaper and it says, major disappointment because the fall won't be as much as they predicted in March. I think, well, what is going on here? This just shows the vested interests that are sitting there wanting to push particular lines. And, if we can see us go through this process through to 2030 and 2035, which we've got to remember is a massive catch-up on the failure to do anything in the decade from 2010 to 2020. And we did nothing there in respect of climate change and renewables. If we can now see that starting to have its impact, then great credit to this government over now 2 terms where they've said, and to Minister Bowen, with all the criticism he's received, that he's been determined to say, no, I'm going to push on because renewables is the way to go. Ultimately, it's the cheaper form of energy and of electricity, and maybe we'll start to see that in the not-too-distant future.
Now, the ACCC, which you used to head, has been on the warpath against supermarkets for misleading advertising, for suggesting they're giving discounted products when they've really manipulated the situation and it's not a real discount. It's had a win against Coles, and it has another case on foot against Woolworths. Do you think these big supermarkets where most people buy their groceries are losing their social license? And do you think that greater powers are needed, in particular divestiture powers, to curb them in extreme circumstances?
I don't think that they're losing their social license. They've suffered a reputation battering, but the reputation battering is probably less to do with this court case, and there are a range of technicalities there. Let me just point out one concern I have with the case, which is that it seems to be saying you can't discount the price of products on your shelf that you've had to raise because, as Justice O'Brien said, because the suppliers have insisted on a price rise because of inflation and supply problems. You can't discount that for 3 months. Now, that seems to me to be anti-competition and anti-consumer. You're saying to consumers, well, you got to wait for 3 months before these prices can be discounted again. And what Coles did was it discounted in less than that 3-month period. And it's copped a serve from Justice O'Brien in the federal court over misleading practices, etc. Now, we could go into a long discussion about that. The real problem that Coles and Woolies have had to face has been the slagging of them by a combination of politicians. And I have to say, unfortunately, at least one of my predecessors, Alan Fells in the ACCC, who have been very free in their use of the words price gouging. Now, I say free in their use of the words because, in fact, there's been a 12-month inquiry by the ACCC, and there's been the opinion expressed by Justice O'Brien in the federal court that says there's no price gouging here. There's been no excessive pricing, and it is not appropriate to be alleging or to slagging off at them as having been involved in price gouging. It hasn't stopped them. You know, there was that ACTU report that was done by Alan Fells, which basically said, all the business was price gouging. Almost, I overstate that, but it's getting beyond common sense and it's getting beyond what's being fair. So their biggest problem has been just that. It's been the slagging off about price gouging, I think, that's caused their biggest problem. They'll get over it. It doesn't stop shoppers going in, and the savvy shopper will look at the prices. They'll know what they paid last time they went in there for whatever it might be. They should look at the unit pricing material that's on every price tag to be able to compare products with different size packets and the like. And the savvy shopper, being careful, ought to know where to go, ought to know whether to go to Coles or to Woolworths or to Aldi or Costco, whatever, and now Amazon. And Amazon is proving to be a very significant competitor in this area. So when people talk about duopolies, and that sounds terrible, duopolies. Well, I'd say there's something worse than that. That's a monopoly. But what we've got now is some very vigorous competition occurring to the point that Aldi now is having to reduce prices to ward off the competition coming from Coles and Woolworths. Who would have thought that would occur? So, the markets and savvy consumers ultimately reign supreme in this area. So I'm not sure that the social license has been affected by the court case. We'll get another flurry of publicity when the Woolworths decision is made. Interestingly, there's this class action, and I'm going to be fascinated to see the class action plaintiffs prove the loss to consumers when the real loss to consumers is the edict by the federal court that you can't reduce prices for a period of 3 months. So even if 4 weeks was the appropriate time when you should be able to reduce prices, unfortunately, consumers, you have to wait 3 months. And that I think is going to be the major loss.
How do you think in general the ACCC is performing, in particular monitoring fuel prices, but also more broadly?
Yeah, look, more broadly, I think Jenny Cass-Gottlieb has brought the ACCC back onto the right track of enforcement of the law. It got diverted, unfortunately, I thought, with too much focus previously on policy development and policy advocacy. That was the result of successive treasurers through the decade of 2011 through to 2020, where what they did was they said, oh, we've got a problem here, we'll get the ACCC to look at it. So the ACCC spent a lot of time on policy formulation, which suited the chair at the time, Rod Sims, because that's it's in his DNA. Whereas my preference as a former lawyer, Jenny Cass-Gottlieb as a lawyer, was all about enforcing the law, carrying out the remit of the ACCC, which is to enforce the law as set out in the Act. Petrol monitoring. I'm sorry, I have to laugh every time I hear about petrol price monitoring because, yeah, we used to do it back in when I was there as chair, and I had a full report on petrol prices and the like. There is nothing the ACCC can do about petrol prices other than to be sure that there is proper competition occurring, that there are no price fixing arrangements occurring between retailers and the like. But in the end, petrol prices are set by international factors. In Australia, we have this rather aberrational price structuring of the the price movements where you have a sort of a sudden lift to a particular price, might be say $2.20, and then gradually competition pulls it down to about $1.70, and then suddenly the retailers say it's the price cycle. The retailers say we're losing money at this rate, so one of them turns around and says, "Whoop, lift it up again to $2.20, and then we'll start the price cycle again of discounting." It's quite aberrational. We never knew what caused it. It's in the system. It's been there for a while. And what the ACCC has done is to have a fuel watch website, which tries to assist you. NRMA does the same thing, tries to assist you in finding out where the cheapest petrol might be on any particular day. And again, the savvy consumer will look for the cheapest petrol, and those who don't care will not worry about it. Diesel's a separate issue on its own. Diesel is not subject to the same international influences as refined petrol is, and it tends to be rather sticky in its price. But it's been very interesting to see the way that diesel prices have dropped over the past 3 or 4 weeks, and we're going to see that happen until the Strait of Hormuz is opened. And gradually the price will drop back, but we'll still have the price cycles. And every time the price goes up, people say it's price gouging. No, it's not. It's just simply a recovery of the petrol retailers and the wholesalers from an unsustainable price discount that had been developed through vigorous competition in the petrol market.
On a very different issue, you conducted a review into the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act for the coalition government, but it was Labor that implemented those changes. What's your reading of what was done?
What Minister Murray Watt has achieved is nothing short of, I won't say miraculous, but it is completely admirable. What he did was he was determined, he was committed, he consulted, and then in a matter of months, not years, he brought about the implementation of virtually all the recommendations of the review in a way that I have to say to you, when the vote took place in the Senate, and I was sitting up in the Senate gallery, the public gallery, and I stood up and I looked at my colleagues in the department, and I just smiled, and then I choked up because I thought, here is their work with me for a year and then another 5 years since then of frustration. And suddenly what Minister Watt had achieved was just extraordinary. So great commendation to him. Again, it shows what happens if you've got courage, determination, commitment, and the ability to communicate what you're doing, that you can get there. And I have to say as well that Sarah Hanson-Young, who led the charge on behalf of the Greens, took an eminently common sense approach in reaching agreement with Minister Watt as to the final legislation, and great commendation to her. And I thanked her afterwards for what she'd done to bring that about. So these things can happen. Now, when we did the review, and I know that the then Environment Minister, Susan Lee, supported it, and I've got proof of that, but she was stymied by Prime Minister Scott Morrison, who was concerned about West Australia, and Roger Cook over there, the Premier, said to him, if this happens, woe betide what's going to happen to mining in Western Australia. The West Australian Chamber of Mines is the only body of all those that I work with through the review process who said that if the Samuel recommendations are adopted, there'll be no new mining projects in Western Australia. And I repeated this in a forum, and the CEO got in touch with me and he was very angry. And I said, well, just read Hansard, mate. That's what you said in the Hansard. And he backed off because that's exactly what they said. But again, it's vested interests that will come out with these extreme comments. And as a result, politicians that don't have the courage and don't have the determination, and unfortunately that's what happened with Prime Minister Scott Morrison at the time, then reform fails. Minister Watt, with the support of the Prime Minister Albanese, said, I'm going to do this. And he did. And it was most admirable, what had been achieved in a matter of, what are we talking, 6-7 months.
Just finally, and very briefly, and looking across the board, do you think reform is harder to achieve now than it was, for example, in the 1980s?
No, I think it is achievable whatever decade we're looking at. We're going through a tough period at the moment because of, quote, cost of living crises and the Iran war and the Ukraine war and supply impacts on inflation and things of this nature, and interest rates rising. Let's say interest rate, golly, I only wish that I'd been through, in all my decades of living and buying houses and the like, I only wish that I had interest rates of 4% plus rather than the 9 to teens of interest rates that that I had to deal with. But it's there. Reform is possible, providing you've got dedication, commitment, proper analysis, courage, and above all, communication. And if you do that, you can do it in any period of time. We're going through a rough period at the moment where there are extremists out there saying that we know you're going through a cost of living crisis. It's actually, I think, more a mortgage crisis than it is a cost of living crisis. But you're going through that, and we've got the saviour for you, and the saviour is A, B, C, D. Well, look, I went through that in the 1990s with competition policy through to the early 2000s. And I remember saying at one stage to a Brisbane radio announcer, I hope that what happens, or that what Pauline Hanson was then advocating, is actually implemented in Queensland, because I will look forward to 12 months' time and be able to demonstrate that it was a load of utter nonsense.
Graeme Samuel, thank you very much for sharing your insights and your views with us today. That's all for our Conversation Politics podcast. Thank you to my producer, Ben Roper. We'll be back with you again soon, but goodbye for now.
Production by Ben Roper. Theme music by Lee Rosevere. The Conversation is a not-for-profit media organisation. Sign up to our daily newsletter for evidence-based news and analysis, including articles from Michelle Grattan, or listen to more of our shows wherever you get your podcasts.
What are you going to have? Can I have 2 pieces of mullet, please, Pauline?
From a fish and chip shop in regional Queensland
We are in danger of being swamped by Asians.
to the heart of Australian politics, this is the unlikely story of the country's most controversial minor party.
Are you xenophobic? Please explain.
For 30 years, One Nation and Pauline Hanson have been ridiculed, dismissed and shut out. Now, no one's laughing.
One Nation continuing to surge in the polls.
Dramatic surge in support for One Nation.
I'm back.
This is the making of One Nation from The Conversation, and you can search for it wherever you listen to podcasts.